We have 63 participants, so why don't we start? Welcome to the panel, Preventing Violent Extremism in the Classroom. I'm Michael Duffin with the State Department. This discussion was originally supposed to take place at South by Southwest, but given the circumstances, we're grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion virtually. And since most students won't be in a classroom for a while, we will also discuss online influences young people are facing. I'm joined by a distinguished panel, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, as a professor at American University, whose book, Hate in the Homeland, the Global Far Right, will come out in the fall. Dr. Mia Bloom is a professor at Georgia State University who wrote the book, Small Arms, Children and Terrorism. Arno Michaelis is a former white supremacist who engages students through Serve to Unite and Parents for Peace. His most recent book is called The Gift of Our Wounds. Deeyah is a filmmaker whose documentaries include Jihad, A Story of the Others, and White Right Meeting the Enemy. Tait is the former mayor of Anaheim who ran on a platform of kindness. And Jennie is a senior advisor at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue who develops tools for educators to address violent extremism. From South Asia to Southern California, we have seen young people become radicalized by hateful and intolerant ideologies that target groups of people they know little or nothing about. Last month, for example, police in Estonia arrested a 13-year-old boy for leading the neo-Nazi group Feuerkrieg Division. Other than family and friends, educators spend the most time with young people. However, few teachers actually have received training on how to recognize the signs of violent extremism or how to prevent or counter it. The goal of preventing violent extremism, or what we will call PVE, is not to turn teachers, coaches, and counselors into informants, but to build resilience in young people so they can resist violent and intolerant ideologies and provide individuals on that path with help before they harm anyone, including themselves. We'll start with Cynthia. You've studied violent white supremacist movements globally for many years. Is the case of the 13-year-old boy from Estonia an aberration, and why are young people drawn to violent white supremacist movements?
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks to South by Southwest EDU for supporting our ability to kind of reconvene in this way. I'm glad we were able to, and also just want to send my best wishes to everybody listening for your health and safety and that of your loved ones in these unprecedented times. I'm glad we're able to have this conversation, at least in a virtual way. So I want to say about that Estonian case, that was shocking to a lot of people. I think a lot of people in the public and the media maybe don't realize how often really young adolescents do get engaged. It was a shocking case because he was so engaged and considered himself to be a leader. I think there are some questions about what that group actually looked like in terms of its hierarchical structure and whether he was leading or just highly engaged. But nonetheless, a 13-year-old highly engaged in a violent white supremacist extremist movement that's calling for a race war is tremendous cause for concern. And there are lots of things that also raises about, he's under the age of 14, which means it wasn't prosecutable in that country, and it raises lots of questions about how you address it when it's gotten that far down the path. And leads lots of questions for us about prevention and earlier stage. So, one of the things I wanted to say is that in my interviews, in over 20 years of interviews with young people in Germany, in and around far-right scenes, what I found is that those who had left those scenes really did say they were most highly engaged between the ages of 12 and 16. So it is, I think, very common to have early engagement in an early adolescent phase. And that is for lots of reasons. That's a time when young people are looking for, they're exploring new identities, they're exploring new friendships, they're experimenting, they're looking for a sense of belonging, they want to have a sense of purpose and figure out what they're doing, and they're more vulnerable to kind of outside influences that try to drive a wedge between them and other trusted adults in their lives in ways that can really kind of facilitate that introduction to nefarious elements kind of online or on the ground in real life. And so I do think it's a really important age to understand. And one of the hopeful things about that, though, is that also it opens up the door to a lot of other partners who should be engaged in the prevention and intervention stage in terms of creating off-ramps. And I think when you start to really understand the potential for young people to get engaged you think about all the other adults that are part of their kind of trusted network, from employers and part-time jobs to teachers and principals and coaches, youth group leaders, you know, anybody else they would engage with, and of course, parents and caregivers in the home, and, you know, grandparents, other adults, the entire network of people in their lives. And if we can find ways to train and inform those people about these risks and ways to intervene more effectively in young people's lives that don't drive them further into a path online, to feel scolded or shamed necessarily, but try to understand in a deep intervention way, that might mean that we have a chance at reaching them before we get to the surveillance and monitoring and law enforcement side of things, when it's often a much deeper and more difficult thing to de-radicalize. So I would say, yes, I think it's common to have that happen, but it also, if we acknowledge that and recognize that, it means engaging a whole new slate of partners, from adolescent therapists and development specialists to teachers and parents, in this kind of fight to prevent it.
Thank you. Mia, your book, Small Arms, takes an in-depth look at the children who lived in ISIS-controlled territory in Syria and Iraq. Thousands of these kids are now back in their home countries, including some in the United States and Canada. What challenges will these children face returning to school, and what lessons can we take from reintegrating child soldiers from conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, thank you again for including me in the panel. And I want to reiterate what Cynthia said, is that I want to wish everyone continued good health, whoever is participating and watching. In the book, Small Arms, what I tried to do was explore the reasons, not just why terrorist groups were manipulating children, but why children might find it at all alluring and attractive. And so I think it's important also to make the distinction whether or not I take the position, I don't think that the children are genuinely radicalized. I don't think really young children can be. So I think part of what I was trying to make clear is the distinction between the children who may parrot what they hear from the adults around them. And so, you know, you always hear this expression that children are like a sponge. And if you swear in front of a kid, that's going to be the one word that they repeat over and over again. But this idea that the children are radical and need to be de-radicalized, I think we start from a problematic first step. Now, as far as the children who were in ISIS and were sent back, a lot of them weren't. Various Western countries absolutely refused to allow the children and the mothers back. A place like Kosovo allowed 74 back. But there are different things that we need to consider. Now, back to reiterate what Cynthia was saying, the role that the parents or that the adults in these children's lives have played is very crucial. And so if we are reintegrating children and we are ignoring the role, for example, of the mothers, I think we're doing a disservice, because in some instances, it might be the mother who continues to feed a steady diet of radical or racist or other viewpoints. But as far as, you know, the lessons learned from child soldiers, and this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, we worked very closely with experts who had spent over 15 years with sort of the transition of child soldiers from militants to integration. And Tanya Zayed is a partner on my project. One of the things that we found is that the very, very young children are going to be okay, that a lot of the psychological negative sequelae associated with having witnessed violence or even participated in violence before a certain age will be something that they can forget. And in fact, this is the part that's counterintuitive. The older children that are very often perceived as the most threatening, that can harken back to some happy memories before the conflict, in ISIS's case, before their parents took them to Syria. Also, you have a good starting point. You have a good base psychologically to harken back to a happier time. So in fact, the children who are most at risk are that middle category, the middle schoolers, the kids who are, 10, 11, up until the age of 15, which is precisely that group that Cynthia's identified as sort of being radical curious. Now, I think it's very important that we understand that all of the kids deserve the opportunity for a happy and normal life. It's just different kinds of interventions that would be applied to each of these different age groups. And then the other thing is, and we didn't have great information about this, but we do know from the child soldier literature, we have to treat the boys and girls a little bit differently because what they experienced was different, what they suffered. And then, you know, the last point that I want to make, because I don't want to monopolize your time, we have to think about, what did the kids see? In other words, the passive consumption of violence is going to have very negative impacts on them to certain degrees. And then what did the kids actually themselves do? Not every child that existed in Syria was one of these Ashbal al-Khilafa or cub of the caliphate. In other words, ISIS actually made training as a cub a rare and a select group. In other words, the kids aspire to join, but not everyone got to. So that, again, they tried to make it desirable. And then the third category, and this is also extremely upsetting, but what was done to the kids? In other words, not just that the kids were given a knife and told, you know, take off this person's head, or even a 4-year-old that was given a remote control and mommy says, press the button, and all of a sudden a car blows up with 3 people inside. But also we know, at least from some of the other conflicts, not necessarily in Syria, but in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, some of these boys were sexually abused. And so because we have to look at these not just through the lens that these are, you know, radicalized individuals, that they were victimizers, but many of these kids were also victims. And that also informs the kinds of interventions we'll need in the future to help them transition to a happy and normal life, which I've seen in places like Pakistan. It can be done. It can be done really successfully. And, you know, from my perspective, I think it should be done. They're children.
Thanks, Mia. Arno, you've spoken on a lot of webinars in the last couple of weeks. I've listened to a couple of them. I've heard your story dozens of times. It's quite compelling. As a singer of a white power band in Wisconsin, you use music to promote a hateful ideology. And by the way, a lot of the music that you and others produced from the 80s and 90s is still available on various websites. Why is music such an important component of recruiting and radicalizing people?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for putting this panel together. I appreciate everybody at South by Southwest, and to my esteemed colleagues on the panel, and to everyone tuning in. I echo my peers' thoughts for your health and safety, and I'm very glad we all had this chance to come together and talk today. Personally, I've been madly head over heels in love with music my entire life. And still am. It's been a honeymoon the whole time, for good, bad, and at times very, very, very ugly. And to me, music is what brought me into white nationalism. I joined, actually started a white nationalist skinhead group in 1987, and it was after hearing a British skinhead band. And that the music was what made the ideology and this really atrocious story that white people are different than everybody else and superior to everybody else and at the same time threatened by everybody else. It made that story not only seem to make sense, but seem to be glorious, like seem to be very seductive and romantic and something that I want to be a part of. And in my personal story, everybody says, well, how did you get into this? What brought you into it? Were your parents racist? The answer is I just like to piss people off. And nothing pisses people off like a swastika. Nothing pisses people off like screaming white power to some bar chords being chugged over an aggressive drum beat. And so that feeling that I'm being rebellious, which again, if you look back through the history of music, even long before rock and roll, there were days when, you know, Mozart was considered a big rebel. And so that's always been kind of an appeal to music, is that I'm doing something different. I'm thinking for myself. I'm acting for myself. This is mine. This music is part of my identity. And that's carried, that's been part of the human experience for the past 200,000 years. And I think it's only become more and more powerful as time went on. In the late 80s, it was all the more powerful because this was a time just slightly before the advent of the internet and social media. And back then, music was the #1 vector to transmit the white nationalist ideology. And that's why there was this huge movement of white power skinheads that arose in the mid and late 80s. And it was all driven by music. And to me, I actually do a workshop on this. Music is a form of practice. And anything that we practice becomes familiar to us. It becomes normal to us. It becomes comfortable to us. And the workshop I do, I show a video of my old band with me on stage screaming horrible racial slurs and inciting violence against all sorts of people. And then I asked the participants, which I've done this with adults, but particularly with the age group that Cynthia and Mia were talking about, that middle school age group, I'd ask the students, what is the music that guy in the video is making? What does that say about him? What do you think he would be like to hang out with? What do you think he does in his day-to-day life? And just get imagination exercise going. And then I ask, if you listen to that music every day, what effect do you think that would have on your life? And then we think about that process of repeating a theme over and over in our head. And that's what music does if it has a theme. If it's violent racist music, you're repeating that theme of violent racism. If it's music that's misogynistic or materialistic or just violent in a random way, you're still repeating those themes. So to finish the workshop, I play a video from a brilliant Brazilian artist. I'm a huge fan of Thalma de Freitas, where she's just really singing this beautiful kind of ethereal, natural beat, and she has this amazing voice. And then you ask the same questions about that video. What does that music say about her? What do you think she's like as a person? What do you think listening to this music every day would do to you? And then we ask ourselves, what music do we listen to every day and what effect does it have on us? So really the reason why music is such a powerful thing is because it's a form of practice, and it's a great reminder for all of us to ask ourselves what we're practicing every day and if it's something that we want to become more familiar with.
Thanks, Arno. Deeyah, you were at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017, and you interviewed many of the leaders of that event for your documentary, White Right. You also interviewed Islamist extremists from the UK in your documentary, Jihad. Why do some young people find these movements so appealing, and why are some young people more resilient than others?
So first of all, thank you very much, Mike, for having me. And what a joy and honor it is to share this panel with these esteemed speakers. I'm just thinking through some of the things that Arno was just talking about, and also I think Mia touched on and Cynthia was alluding to as well. I think in the interviews that I've done, what really struck me is that when we think about extremisms and we think about these various ideologies, we often sort of focus in on the ideology and the intellectual aspects of it, which is fair, but I feel like we place more emphasis on that than what I feel underpins the ideologies, which is feelings. It's people's emotions and feelings. And I believe, one of the reasons, being a former musician myself, one of the reasons, Arno's music was such an incredible delivery system for this type of message was, what is it that music does? Music speaks to your heart. It speaks to your feelings. It bypasses the intellect. And eventually it brings that along with it. And I think what extremists do so brilliantly is that they're able to capitalize and sort of manipulate the basic human and emotional needs that young people have, that truly all of us have. And what I found a lot is that a lot of the young people who find themselves susceptible to this have backgrounds of experiencing abuse or addiction or mental health problems, everything sort of in the realm of feeling, and the lack of tools and skill sets to be able to cope with those feelings in a healthy, productive way, and the lack of adults in their lives who can engage with them in a safe, in a supportive way. So I think that was one of the sort of unifying traits that I saw, or underpinnings that I saw in both the white supremacist movement and also in the young people that found themselves drawn to the various jihadi movements. What is it that makes some young people resilient? Because when I sat with the former jihadis, basically, they would sit there and they would do this whole laundry list of, I felt this, I went through that, I felt alienated, I felt excluded, I felt like I didn't matter, like no one cared. I was angry, you know, they would say all these different things, and like I didn't belong, and I wasn't accepted by my society. My family didn't understand me either. And I remember sitting there going, okay, me too, me too, me too, me too. I can relate to all of this. So why is it that somebody like me chose to pick up a camera and not a gun, right? If I come from that same feeling and that same intensity of feeling. And the only answer that I sort of could come to was, it mattered when I was at my most broken or at my most insecure and most vulnerable, who showed up? What adults and people, peers, showed up in my life? Was it people that were supportive and loving and understanding and willing to listen and share in my feelings? Or was it people that cynically took those feelings and tried to manipulate that into, you know, towards their own gains? And so that sort of point that I found was the biggest reason why I and many, many other young people who do come from, you know, certain experiences don't go down the path of violence and others do. And one other point that I would also like to just highlight before I end is there's something about idealism that young people have that I think is very noble, and I think is really inspiring and really wonderful. And I think as a society and as communities, we don't really engage with that to the extent that we ought to. That sense of wanting to be a part of something greater than oneself, wanting to change the world, wanting to contribute, and wanting to feel like you can. And here you have these groups that gives you that, and also gives you, in your periods of uncertainty and sort of confusion about what's going on in the world, what does it mean to you, how do you fit into that, and how do people fit in around you? These movements give you those black and white answers, and they give you something to feel passionate about. They give you also who to blame for everything that you're feeling and everything that is unprocessed within you. So those are just some of the observations that I had in spending as much time as I now have with young people like that. But I would say feelings is something that we shouldn't underestimate. And also I think the way we engage with young people, we have to be willing to listen and not judge and condemn. We have to be willing to be there with them and walk them through it as they figure their way out of this.
Absolutely. Mayor Tait, many people know Anaheim as the home of Disneyland, but a century ago, the Ku Klux Klan held 4 of the 5 seats on city council. And in 2016, when you were mayor, the KKK marched through the streets of Anaheim. As the former mayor, and before that, a member of the Anaheim City Council, how can local government officials help educators address the hate and polarization that they are seeing in the classroom?
Hey, thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. And as with the rest of you, I wish everyone good health this time. And I should say thank you for bringing up that incident, Michael, about the KKK rally in Anaheim, because that's not what Anaheim's all about. And it is true, we have a history that goes 100 years ago. There was a major Klan rally in Anaheim, which is surprising in Southern California at that time, mostly anti-Catholic. But what I'm proud of in the city is that the Klan had actually taken over the council back then, and the people rose up and kicked him out of office, voted him out of office, and fired the police chief back then, who was a member of the Klan. And it was actually a wonderful response. And there's really been no Klan, even thought of a Klan since then. And here in 2016, our mayor ran on a platform of kindness, where the city's, which is about culture change, and things are going great. And here comes this. I get this notice there's going to be a Klan rally, and as mayor, of course, that's just kind of a shocking thing to hear. And that turned into actually kind of a melee with counter demonstrators, and some injuries involved. Worldwide news. but what I'm really proud about is how the city responded. And the next day, the community on their own went to that park, and about 300 people did a candlelight vigil, marched to City Hall, singing songs and had a big banner that said "City of Kindness." So that I think that comes from culture change. And when I ran, I ran on a platform of kindness, actually kindness and freedom. But it was about changing culture, because we all know that why is one organization different from another? Why is one university different? It's about culture, and it's how people think. And if you could actually change a culture of a organization, and when I ran, I thought, well, a CEO has a lot of authority or power to do that in a company, a teacher in a classroom, a principal at a school. Why not a mayor in an entire city? And if you get the entire city thinking, hey, we're supposed to be a little kinder. This is who we are. We're from Anaheim. If that happens, literally everything gets better in your city, everything. And so with the schools, I guess to answer your question, I'm finally getting there, Michael. But a lot of times in local government, there's a separation between city government, mayor, council, and the schools, because usually they're run by a school board. And I think that's a really missed opportunity to connect from City Hall to the schools. And so what we did, and I had great school boards, great superintendents. And one of the things we did was, after I got elected, in the elementary school district, about 24,000 kids, they did 1 million acts of kindness. These are K through 6, and it was a beautiful thing. And Deeyah, you mentioned about kids want to do something, and it connects that is bigger than themselves. And these kids did, and we talked about, hey, we're going to change the world, and we're all going to do 1 million acts of kindness, and each school would hit their goal. Then we had an assembly, and I go, and it was actually the most joyful day of being mayor. We had these assemblies. But if so imagine being a bully in a school where every kid's doing about 50 acts of kindness. It just, including the kid that might have been a bully or done bullying things, let me put it that way. It just kind of falls off the table. And anecdotally, talking to principals, they said, things like bullying did fall, cut in half. District-wide suspensions cut in half during that time. So it's just about creating that culture, I guess, of kindness. And we did another thing with, we started a program through the Kindness Initiative called AIM, Anaheim Innovative Mentoring Experience, where you team up kids in high school with adults in the community, the business community, and something like, it's well over 1,000 kids participate in that. So there's all sorts of different ways. We put up, signs at schools, Kindness Way, street signs. So keep on reminding people that we're a place of kindness, a city of kindness. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, if you say the vision is, if you're from Anaheim, you think, okay, I'm from a city of kindness. I'm expected to be a little bit kinder. So now if you put all the interactions amongst people every day in your city, millions of them, and label them as either kind or not kind. Kind here, not kind way up here. Now, if you could change the culture or city of kindness, a chance of doing something kind's a little bit greater, then this starts to go like this. And when it goes like this, everything gets better. Like bullying in your schools, senior neglect, addiction, all these things that happen in your city get better. And of course, it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost anything at all.
And thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more about your efforts to promote kindness in a bit. Jennie, we've talked a lot about the factors that contribute to young people supporting violent extremism. But what are some of the tools ISD has developed to help educators prevent their students from radicalizing?
Oh, hi everyone. Thanks for having me today. Before we talk about what ISD has done, and we've been working in this space for over 5 years now across Europe and also in Canada, I think it's really important to understand what some of the barriers to good violence prevention education are in schools, and those are both operational and content-based. So the very first thing to think about is that most education systems around the world are based on a very old-fashioned student-teacher dynamic, where the student is seen as a purveyor of information, and students are expected to absorb that knowledge and regurgitate it in exams. So it's some form of rote memorization. So when it comes to a topic like this, which is extremely sensitive and is largely based not on knowledge and much more on competencies and skills, that puts the vast majority of the globe's educators in an extremely awkward position. And the system itself is not geared for teachers to be enablers of discussion, to facilitate conversation with their students. That is not the power dynamic that they have. So that is one really key barrier. The second is that when you're talking about things like identity, belonging, alienation, potentially legitimate grievance within a lot of marginalized communities or disaffected communities, those are areas which are absolute danger zones for teachers. They don't want to go near them with a barge pole because they are so fraught with potential disaster, and that they don't often see that as their mandate. They see a duty of care to young people that within the borders of their classroom, they need to make sure that conversation doesn't stray into anything that's prejudicial or that their students feel safe. But that's very different from saying, no, part of your role as an educator is that you need to be actively curating conversations about young people's status in society and their interaction online. Oh, I've just been told my connection is unstable, so let me.
Well,
can everyone hear me?
We can hear you
Okay.
fine, yes.
So the third barrier I would say is about where you place this content within the curriculum, because it doesn't immediately have a natural fit for most teachers. If you've signed on to be a teacher of history or of English, you might not immediately think, oh, I have the competency and the expertise to be able to deliver this type of content. And then the fourth enormous challenge is the changing threat landscape. The reality is that extremist movements evolve. They are constantly mutating, changing, morphing, joining each other, developing new sophisticated tools for communication. And it's almost impossible to create an updated information pipeline to schools so that they're constantly on the back of new trends. It's an unrealistic expectation for school sectors that are already struggling with very overcrowded school days and the demands of the exam system and what is required by law that they have to teach. The second thing I wanted to talk about is some of the major pitfalls, I think, of trying to do violence prevention education. And that is that it's extremely easy to fall into the trap of focusing on the immediate trends, platforms, outlets, and risks, and much less on the base skills and competencies that you need to avoid becoming radicalized long term. So at any moment in time, there is always going to be a particular fad that is generating potentially legitimate hysteria in the counter-extremism world. In the last 6 months or a year, we've seen an enormous amount of public discourse and coverage around deepfakes, around coordinated disinformation campaigns, around alt media platforms like Gab and Dissenter and Telegram, about the re-emergence of 4chan via 8kun, about gaming. And those things may well be apposite in the moment, and it's not that there doesn't need to be work taking place, but those things are always going to have a shelf life. And in a year's time, the panic will not be about the Daily Stormer. The panic will not be about Telegram. The panic will not be about Minecraft or Reddit. It will be about whatever's filled that platform and that vacuum. So it's really critical that any curricula or interventions that are being developed in schools do not think too obsessively about what's happening at that immediate moment in time, because it will become defunct extremely quickly. There's also a lot of evidence that just teaching young people these outlets are trustworthy and credible and these outlets aren't is extremely counterproductive. And that's not only for young people, that actually relates to all demographics within the population. So when Facebook introduced its new functionality that it would tell you when sources were verified or not verified, obviously they couldn't cover absolutely every post that was going online. And what happens is that people become lazier because what they think is, oh, everything which hasn't actively been badged as false must be true. So you can very quickly create a situation where people are resting on their laurels because they say, okay, I've been given a list of things that I should look at and a list of things that I should avoid, but you're never going to be able to keep pace with the breadth and scale of the internet. So when it comes to how we develop our resources at ISD, we always come back to what are the core skills? And if you detach from the content itself, what is it about your relationship with content that defines the way young people use the internet? And this really relates to what the other panelists have said today, that radicalization is not necessarily about the propaganda. It's about yourself as a user. It's about what you bring to the table when you read a story. What is the lens through which you are viewing content? And so for us, it's less about materials and it's more about identity. So we do give them with some of the tools, the kind of core armory that you need to be a savvy and competent digital user. So that's understanding things like mis and disinformation and how you can spot fake URLs. But we also have modules around things like emotional manipulation. And that can be both positive and negative. And we use examples like recruitment videos for the army or climate change adverts. And then we compare it with things that have a slightly more insidious intention. So we're not saying emotional manipulation is always bad. What we're saying is, if you have a visceral response to anything that you see online, interrogate why that's the case. Because that in and of itself should be a red flag. You should have some friction online, which means you should have a gap between, a sort of deliberative gap between seeing something and what you do in response to that thing. So what we're trying to do, I really like that term friction. I feel like it's really evocative. It's a word that my colleague introduced me to in this context, which is we're trying to create more of those stage gates in people's mind between them seeing things and them doing something in response. That might be sharing, that might be posting, that might be delving into some dark rabbit hole of the internet. And equally, the last thing, I'm sure I've gone over time, is our programs really place a big emphasis on credible messengers. So one of the programs we've developed is called Extreme Dialogue, and it maps the stories of people who've been affected by violent radicalization directly. So that includes former IRA, former neo-Nazi, returning ISIS fighters, and it talks about exactly what the other panelists have mentioned. What was the compelling part of becoming a member of those movements, and equally what planted the seed of doubt that eventually led to them leaving the movement. And equally, we look at people who've been affected by it as victims of hate speech or hate crime. And then when we go into schools, we really try and use as much as possible young facilitators, very often who come from ethnic minority or religious minority backgrounds, who feel contemporary and feel relevant for young people. So they create the initial enthusiasm about this topic, and then you can rely on teachers to embed those learning outcomes in a longer term curriculum.
Thank you. I want to turn to Cynthia and Mia. Jennie touched on a bit on the tools that we use, educators can use to address violent extremism in the classroom. But obviously now with a lot of people at home spending many more hours online than we're used to, I want to know, does this make it easier or harder for violent extremists to recruit? And do you expect increased online radicalization to lead to offline acts of violence, whether it's Baltimore or Bangladesh?
Mia, all right, I'll take the floor first. You know, I've been referring to this sort of era that we're in as a perfect storm for potential radicalization, meaning, you know, we don't have a ton of metrics yet, and so you can't say exactly what's happening in terms of the rising, you know, numbers of people being involved, or but certainly, you know, what we have are signs that extremist groups are mobilizing in new ways and mobilizing around the virus, using it to spread conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, enact hate crimes against Asian Americans or Asians, and even threaten, biological terror with the use of the virus. All kinds of anti-government, as we know, calls for civil war. So lots of mobilizing around it, and then the spread of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and conspiracies about the virus, its origins, and the government's response to them has been obviously also very, very high in terms of what people are seeing on social media. So on the one hand, you have a mobilized set of extremist groups or individuals circulating information. On the other hand, you have 91% of children in the world whose schools have shut down. I mean, that's from 2 weeks ago. It's probably even higher. In the US alone, we have 70 million young people who are now learning at home or not learning at home, right? I mean, in some cities, 30% of kids aren't even logging on to the systems that the school districts are providing, either because they don't have access or they don't have a safe way to do it, or it's not a good environment for them to do it. So, and even in the best of situations, it's extremely unstructured, with very little synchronous learning in order to, for good reasons, try to create equity so that not everybody who can get online or has to share devices doesn't have to be, on a device all day long. But that means what you have are parents struggling to work, to find time to work, giving their kids more screen time, a lot more access and time online in unstructured ways where kids are basically exploring the internet, looking for sources, looking for material. So that's that. And then on top of that, all of those emotional vulnerabilities that folks have talked about already are heightened. We have a time of extreme isolation, anxiety, economic precarity, fears for their safety, seeing family and friends and loved ones get sick or being afraid that that will happen. And so all of those kinds of vulnerabilities create more opportunities for them to be susceptible to groups that offer a kind of simplistic solution or scapegoats for what's happening and try to explain it away. And so I think, in terms of those vulnerabilities, yes, we're in a perfect storm. And I think there's no question that we will have heightened likelihood of violence, particularly in places where we're going into volatile election seasons already and where we have highly armed populations that are not necessarily thinking in complete rational ways. So I am quite concerned about the potential for more violence. And I think, I'll just say that one of the things that I think is really important for us to do is have these conversations cross-nationally too, because I think a lot of the dilemmas that we're having and the solutions that we're trying to create for parents, for caregivers, for people working with young people still in school settings or in therapeutic settings, or for the law enforcement and monitoring, we don't need to reinvent a solution in each place. So the more that we can, even in these times of extreme isolation, continue conversations across borders about what are some best practices, what are some metrics that show us what's working, how can we reach out to new partners for interventions. I think those are really important things for us to continue to try to do. I'll turn it over to Mia.
Well, I would reiterate everything Cynthia says. I always agree with Cynthia, but there's a few things that we're noticing in terms of trends. There seem to be three major ways in which many of these extremist organizations are capitalizing on COVID-19. The first is that they're using it as, for purposes of recruitment. The major push in places around the world, whether it's Yemen or Jordan or Pakistan, has been to distrust the government. So they're using COVID-19 either to show that the governments are incapable of protecting you or that they are ultimately corrupt and that they will allocate their benefits solely to people who support them as a form of patronage. And this actually helps exacerbate tensions, sectarian and ethnic tensions in different countries. So for example, in places like Nigeria or in Sri Lanka, as the government views the Muslim population as a dangerous minority that is prone to radicalization, they're not allocating the benefits, either resources or even PPE and hand sanitizer to those Muslim communities. And so you'll have extremists come in, swoop in and say, you see, we told you all along, the government doesn't care about Muslims, they don't care if you die. And they reinvent themselves as service providers. They fill in that gap. And that helps them recruit. It also helps them challenge the authenticity and the legitimacy of that existing, very often secular government. The other thing that they've been using, let's say in the jihadi context, has been, this reaffirms our apocalyptic visions of the future. We've been telling you that the world is about to end, and so you better join us now while you still have time. And you'll even see in places like in Yemen, in Malaysia, in Syria, and other places where they will say, it's better to die a martyr than to die from COVID-19 at home. And so again, they are pushing their own agenda. But I think that this is where we really need to be sensitive to what young people are experiencing. The fact is, many of these extremists have these ideologies to begin with, and they're using the pandemic to sort of to push their own perspectives that they've always pushed, but now with a slightly different tinge. As far as the extended period online is concerned, what we're seeing, you know, like Cynthia is saying, that 91%, if not more, if schools are closed, we're seeing that groups like ISIS or even some of the other Al-Qaeda linked groups are using the extended time online to actually increase the functionality of their websites, to become more sophisticated. In other words, Telegram, which is the semi-encrypted platform that ISIS has used, and me and my research team have been studying it for 4 years. There was a huge downturn after ISIS lost territory in Syria and Iraq. Starting in 2018, you see a decrease in the amount of channels and propaganda. And what was interesting is that during the pandemic, all of the channels were revived. And while we were sitting at home watching Netflix, they had like a virtual jihadi Netflix of propaganda videos, beheading videos, sermons, everything that they deposited. And so while people were at home, they were streaming this material. So it was twofold. It was about inundating online the message and reinforcing the message, but also exploiting the fact that people are just online for hours and hours at a time. And now in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, they're able to exploit that further by increasing the levels of sophistication. So this is where, you know, it's all different kinds of extremist organizations are capitalizing on COVID-19, and they're truly exploiting it. And so it is very dangerous. And it's hard for parents now to try to control screen time, because so much of that screen time is legitimate screen time for class or for research. And it's really hard to tell kids, especially in confined spaces, okay, well, you know, get off your computer now. So it does increase the vulnerabilities, and I think it poses new challenges.
Thanks, Mia. Jennie, going back to you, we've touched on digital literacy, critical thinking, but how can educators turn this into turn theory into practice, and how can they tell if this is actually moving the needle in their classrooms?
Sure. The first thing that I think is really important is about deciding where you situate it within the school day. So there's good arguments for various different pathways, but what I personally believe is that you need to find a balance between having some part of the curriculum that is carved out for digital literacy. In some countries, it's aligned with citizenship education. In some countries, it fits with ICT, so information technology classes. In the UK, it's used in personal, social, and health well-being classes. And that means that there's going to be some dedicated, systematic attention paid to these topics in schools. The other thing is to consider this as sort of the third evolution of education around digital topics. So first we started with digital safety, which was the real basics. Then there was a wave of enthusiasm and momentum around digital skills with things like coding, and you saw this massive influx of coding initiatives in schools. And now we're moving on to what we at ISD call digital citizenship, which is really an entirely different beast. And essentially what you're asking young people is, what does it mean to be a citizen in the online space? We have quite a clear conception in the offline space, even if you don't do it, of what it means to be part of a society. You pay your taxes, you vote, you contribute to your community, you volunteer, you are nice to your neighbors, you pick up litter. But we do not have that same rubric when you think about the internet. And so part of what putting digital citizenship into practice means is saying to young people, not just be terrified of the web, everything is trying to deceive you, everything is toxic and that is an inevitability online, that really should not be the message of these education interventions, because all that does is scare people into apathy, or it scares them into even worse digital habits, because what they do is say, okay, so I can't trust anything online. So I will just assume that the BBC is equivalent to some vlogger on YouTube. They're both untrustworthy and everything is equally bad. So it is absolutely critical that these interventions move from education, which is giving them the basic understanding of these topics, filter bubbles, echo chambers, the actual infrastructure of how platforms work, and things that they might not realize about how they are being manipulated by the nature of these platforms themselves. But then the far more important element that's really underserved is to think about applied learning. So once you know you've been enlightened and you've been opened up to this world of nuance on the web, what are we then asking young people to do? We're not just asking them to be critical consumers, we're asking them to be content producers. We're asking them to be active digital leaders. We are asking them to provide pastoral care to their peers that they see online being abused. We're asking them to report content that is concerning. We're asking them to be much more attuned to what is taking place on their feed and what the broader implications of it might be. So for me, what teachers can do is they can really revive some of those elements of applied learning which are often neglected. The absolute best way to test whether their education programs are working is to look at the outputs from applied learning. So it's really difficult to say to a young person, you can do a pre-survey and a post-survey about their skills, their level of knowledge of certain terms, their likelihood of doing something online. But unless you sit there and surveil them online, which is totally unethical and unfeasible, you're not actually going to be able to see whether they have better online habits. Instead, it makes a lot more sense to say, okay, let's do some student journalism, or let's do some detective work. And from that, you can see whether or not they've embedded those learning concepts. The other thing I would say in terms of placing it in the curriculum is there is a totally missed opportunity to think about finding subject-specific points of entry for this content. Because what lies at the core of digital literacy and, countering radicalization is critical thinking, debate, understanding bias, and all of those things can be situated elsewhere within national curricula. So why isn't it that an English curriculum can look at unfaithful narrators in literature and use that as a prompt to talk about the role of who's writing a piece of content online? Why can't a history curriculum look at the way that propaganda has been used in conflicts? Every British school kid studies World War II. It's an amazing chance to think about mis and disinformation in a historical context. Why can't science talk about the anti-vaxxer movement and the way that conspiracy theories spread and are proliferated and capitalized on people's fear? So that is a really great way to get over the barrier of teachers feeling out of their comfort zone, because what you're saying to them is, no, this is absolutely within your wheelhouse. This is what you're already teaching. These are just basic skills that you would hope every student is picking up when they're in the classroom and when they're in the school environment, and you can definitely be a part of the solution.
Thank you. I want to turn to Mayor Tait and focus the conversation on kindness and meeting a lot of former violent extremists, Arno included. They've talked about how people were kind to them who, some of the people who they targeted were nice to them, co-workers or whatnot. You ran on a platform of kindness, as you mentioned previously. Why is kindness so important to you, and how do you implement it within the city of Anaheim? And can you also, how did the Dalai Lama and Lady Gaga get involved in this?
Oh, well, kindness is, I think it's why we're all here as human beings. It's the most important thing. And kindness defined as doing something for somebody else, helping somebody else with no expectation return. And it's been kind of interesting, and a lot get involved in some of these movements, it seems to be it's a false kindness that brings people in oftentimes, which is kind of interesting. But it is the way I came about this platform was I'd served for 10 years on the city council back from '94 to '04, and towards the end of that term, I noticed someone had put signs up around Anaheim that said just simply "Make kindness contagious." And I met the man who put these up, and his name was Dr. Jayevsky, and he's a holistic doctor from Argentina, and he lived in Anaheim. And he told me a story about how they'd been on vacation, family vacation, and his little 6-year-old daughter Natasha was killed in an accident. And when they came home, she had written all these beautiful things. This little 6-year-old girl written all these beautiful things about kindness. And when other kids, the community came out, and her school was talking about Natasha, how she would talk and write about kindness all the time when other kids were playing video games or whatnot. So then Dr. Jayevsky says, he says, in medicine, you can either treat the symptoms or you can stimulate the body to heal from within holistically. He said, that's what I do as a holistic doctor. And then he says, I think the same principle applies for a city. You either treat the symptoms or you can stimulate the city to heal from within holistically. He says, I think that's something to do with kindness. So for me, that was, because I had 10 years of symptom treating, and I saw, I call it the whack-a-mole game of symptom treating, that at 10 years, the city is kind of the same after 10 years of being on the council. So that was a moment, because I know culture. If you change culture, you can change everything. And that's where I mentioned earlier. I thought, boy, it's all about culture. If we get everyone as a city thinking, knowing that they're in a city of kindness, then everything will get better. So 6 years later, I ran on that platform. I took 6 years off, and I really felt I had to run and try this, and it resonated with the people of Anaheim. I had to overcome a little bit of fear and people thinking I wasn't serious or kind of Pollyannish. But people were like, I first started talking about it, people were like, yeah, we get it. Something deeper needs to happen. So I ran on that platform. I won by quite a large margin, got reelected on that platform by a large margin. And as we're doing this, the kids did 1 million acts of kindness. That got some publicity, and that got the attention. You asked about the Dalai Lama, got the attention of his emissary, a man named Lama Tenzin Dowden, who had contacted me and invited my wife Julie and I to Dharamsala to meet His Holiness. And we ended up spending 3 days with him. We happened to be there with Bishop Desmond Tutu, his most incredible 3 days. And the Dalai Lama said he believes the path to world peace is creating a culture of kindness in cities, but particularly schools. He said that's the path. He said in a generation we'll have world peace. And that's why he was interested in what we're doing in Anaheim. Then, and that led to him coming to Anaheim to celebrate his 80th birthday. And then that led to I asked him if he would speak to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he enthusiastically agreed. And we then asked. We thought it'd be interesting because we knew of Lady Gaga and her work with anti-bullying. If she'd like to join him on stage, and she through her mother, actually through Cynthia, we asked her mother, and they agreed. And also a gentleman named Phil Anschutz, who's started something called randomactsofkindness.com, who's a billionaire philanthropist. So we had this incredible panel at U.S. Conference of Mayors, and Lady Gaga talked about bravery. Actually, her platform is bravery and kindness. And so rather than saying, don't bully, if you create a school where kids are kinder, things like bullying and LGBTQ discrimination and things like that kind of fall off the table. So anyways, it's an incredible conference. And that had led to Michael. I know we've traveled together to Dusseldorf, and why this is relevant to extremism. And if you think about it, if you live in a city that's that you consider kind, people generally don't hate people who are kind to them. They just don't. You just can't. And the people I met, and Arno, when we met, Arno was out. We met at a conference in Center of Peace and Kindness. Ola Schoenfeld put that on, and we had a chance to hear Arno talk. And it's acts of kindness that brings people out. That seems to be consistent. People that people thought they would have hated, an act of kindness. And so if you imagine, in a generation, I mean, this maybe it's not the immediate issue, but in a generation, if you could get a city to change its culture, where it's a kind people, rather than having this many people who hate you, maybe after generations, just a small group. And I think that's what the Dalai Lama was talking about. If you create that culture. And then we talked about schools and curriculum, random acts of kindness. I'll throw this out, randomactsofkindness.org. They've developed a curriculum, and it's just like Jennie was talking about. It creates, so when you're teaching history, it brings in acts of kindness, or maybe in the English class, rather than writing how do you write a letter to order a sack of potatoes, maybe how do you write a letter to console a friend who lost his brother, or something like that. And it ingrains kindness in the curriculum, and they've had great success. And it's all for free too. So you might, if anyone's listening for a curriculum, randomactsofkindness.org. That. But anyway, it is why we're here as human beings, and it's universal, and it's central to every religion, and to it's a universal value, and it's so easy, and it's free, and and we all have the ability to affect culture. So it empowers us all to do something about this.
Thank you. Want to turn to Deeyah. You spent a lot of time with white supremacists for white right, and the connection some of them form with you. You, as the daughter of Muslim immigrants from Pakistan, caused them to doubt their involvement in a hateful and intolerant movement. Were there any lessons from filming that you think we could apply to educators?
I'm so touched, Mayor Tait, by what you've just said. And I think that kindness actually is absolutely at the center of this topic. And I think because it brings dignity back to the table, I think because it makes human connections possible. I'm really inspired and touched by what you've said, and touching on what Nia was saying earlier as well. Kindness and caring about somebody, or at least gesturing in that way, I think is what extremists absolutely are engaged in. When you're looking at various groups, for example, in the Middle East and in North Africa, where there is that vacuum of power, where there is that vacuum of leadership and caring for one's citizens, that is where extremist groups actually swoop in and provide medicine, provide healthcare, provide whatever social support, food, whatever, for suffering and struggling communities. So yes, this word kindness, I'm probably not going to be able to sleep now, because what you've said is just going to be stirring around in my mind. But in answer to your question, Mike, the whole purpose of making the film that I did, and the reason I wanted to sit down with white supremacists in the first place, is I wanted to see if it would be possible to sit down with people like that, and for them to recognize my humanity. If we sit face to face, is that possible? And similarly, is it possible for me to recognize theirs? Because it's not just one way. It's not just that they dehumanize people like me. It's also people like me tend to dehumanize them as well. I've been afraid of people like that most of my life. I've been pissed off at them. I've been all kinds, I've thrown things at them. I've gone to all the kind of anti-fascist protests my entire life, and very much engaged in actions towards them that are dehumanizing. So I would say holding on to making the recognition of their humanity and your own sort of something that we don't negotiate away, something that we are not willing to trade away in any kind of engagement that we have. I think making human connections is absolutely crucial. I was very, it was sort of a conscious decision on my part not to go in and sit with them and try to out-argue them and out-debate them and bring my facts to the table against their facts, and just for us to have this kind of dance with each other where we both get to win, win in the sense that I get to pat myself on the back for being a fantastic anti-racist person with all the correct political views and whatever, and for them to walk away getting to be the big Nazi and, talking down to some brown woman and really showing her. I didn't want our engagement to be on that level. I wanted the engagement to be much more human and much more basic and much more what I was saying earlier, based in our feelings. What does it feel like to be me? What does it feel like to be him? Is it possible for me to put myself in his shoes for 1 second and imagine why the world looks the way that it does to him? You know, in his mind, he's not the villain of the story. In his mind, he's still the hero of the story. So trying to understand what it is about this that is heroic, what it is about this that is noble, what it is about this that connects to whatever it is that he needs. So my kind of policy was that I'm not going to condemn him. I'm not going to write him off, because he expects that. He wants that. And he wants me to get pissed off. He wants me to dehumanize him, because that's where he gets everything that he needs. And so that what I learned from so that those were all sort of intentional kind of gestures on my part that I walked into these rooms with. I had no idea if it was actually going to work, though, mind you. So what I walked away learning from this is that not with all of them, but with most of them, it was possible to connect. It was possible, which this I never would have expected. If you would have said this to me, you know, a couple of years ago, you're going to become friends with Nazis, I would have been really offended that you would think that I would do that. But that has happened. I have managed to become friends with them. It doesn't mean that we don't confront them on their beliefs and that we don't push back, but it's how you do that. If you do that in a confrontational, judgmental way, or if you do it in a, I'm willing to listen, and then let's see if I can try to have you understand it from my point of view. I'm willing to listen to your point of view, so now you listen to mine. So I would say listening for educators out there, as appalling as some of the views might seem to you, as troubling and uncomfortable as you might feel, I would highly, highly recommend still remaining in the space of listening, being willing to listen. Don't give up on them. Whatever you do, you must not give up on them. There is always hope. You just have to find that part of them that will be willing to listen and that you can actually reason with or connect with. So I guess what is the word for that is, it would be empathy. Is try to stay in that space, try to have empathy. And empathy does not equal sympathy. You don't agree with them. Of course, I don't agree with them talking about people like me being exterminated. Obviously, I don't agree with them. But it's trying to find points where we can meet and connect and then go from there. So those were the lessons for me, is absolutely listen, do not give up on them, and try as hard as it is, as much as they try to push your buttons, stay in the space of empathy, and push back, but do it in a way that keeps their dignity and their humanity intact. So don't do to them what they would want to do to you.
That's it. And one of the people that Deeyah interviewed was Arno, who by that time was decades removed from being a white supremacist. Arno, you touched on it earlier. I mentioned it as well. Could you just briefly talk about one of the stories of the coworker when you were showing up late to work, slacking off, and it was obvious that you were involved in a neo-Nazi movement? How that experience helped you leave that movement? This is a question I want to pose to other panelists after you speak, but was there anything, or is there anything that, how can educators have that difficult conversation with that person who, if you go to the KKK march in Anaheim in 2016, and there are people saying vile things, holding up vile signs, and you're there saying, I want to hug you, I want to be kind to you, that may not be the best. Is that really the best approach?
I think the key thing that needs to be conveyed over and over and over again, and Mayor Tait did such a beautiful job of it, and Deeyah is an example of this as well, is that kindness is power. It's not capitulation. It's defiance. It is taking control of a situation. In our Serve to Unite program, we have a part of it called Global Mentors, and it's basically connecting people from all over the world with our classrooms via telepresence. And one of our global mentors is a man named Bjorn Ehler, who's a survivor of Tait Island. And I connected Bjorn with a bunch of middle school kids, and this kid, Nathan, who was 12, said to Bjorn, "How can you not want to hurt the guy that killed your friends?" I get choked up thinking about this. The kid said, "How can you not want to hurt the guy that killed your friends?" And Bjorn said, "Because I'm not someone who hurts people, and he's not going to change that." And that's, I mean, that's power. That's not laying down. That's not getting walked over. That's saying you can murder 69 of my friends in front of me, and you're not going to change the way that I look at the world. Like I'm hard pressed to think of anything more defiant than that, more of a statement of power than that. And going back to my story, when I was a white nationalist skinhead, everything I did during every waking moment of my day was meant to provoke hostility. Like Deeyah said, I wanted people to hate me. I wanted them to swing at me. That was ultimately that was the jackpot, was if I could get another human being to physically attack me. That was what, and that's why I'm very outspoken against violent anti-fascists, because they feed neo-Nazis. That was a victory for me. But I was so fortunate that throughout the 7-year involvement in white nationalist skinheads, there was person after person after person, whether it was a Jewish boss or a lesbian supervisor or Black and Latino coworkers or an elderly woman who worked at McDonald's, who refused to capitulate to my hostility and reflect it, which is ultimately what I wanted from them. And instead they said, no, I'm going to dictate the rules of engagement of our interaction. And if anybody would like to know exactly what this looks like, all you have to do is watch Deeyah's film, White Right Meeting the Enemy, because she did that throughout the film. She dictated the terms of engagement. In my intervention work, especially over the last few years, I've been working with a lot of veterans of the US military. And it's brought me to a point where I need to like really think tactically. And if you know your enemy's objective, it puts you in a much better tactical position than you would be if you didn't know that objective. So knowing that your enemy wants you to reflect their aggression and they want you to be putty in their hands and to hate them back, it makes zero tactical sense to do that, no matter how righteous it may feel. And I say this as someone who I'm most tempted to turn into old Arno when I'm staring my old self in the face. That when I'm face to face with someone in the Ku Klux Klan or a neo-Nazi, I have a very difficult time not being putty in their hands and not giving them the violence that they're looking for. It's taking a breath, creating those stages that Jennie was talking about, creating a separation and restoring control of the situation back to me rather than handing it over to my opponent, that has enabled me to successfully intervene with people in hate groups and get them to leave, and not just leave, but become advocates for kindness. And I love what Mayor Tait said about, like, let's be, the best anti-bullying is pro-kindness. Like, let's be about what we're for rather than what we're against. And the very brave people that I encountered when I was visibly hateful and violent, who defied me with their kindness, helped to change the course of my life and brought me to a point where I was not only had left these hate groups, but many years later, albeit, I had reached a point where it became my life's goal to bring about a society where all people are valued and included, and where kindness is a value that and a practice that we have not only as a community or as a business organization or a school, but as a society and as a human race. I think fully agree with the Dalai Lama that if we could make this a practice, we could absolutely have world peace within a generation.
Jennie, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add. Firstly, there's a very small outfit called the Center for Empathy in International Affairs, which was founded by a guy called Matt Waldman, who was one of the advisors working on negotiations in the Middle East. in Afghanistan, and now I think he's the special advisor or one of the special advisors around the Yemen conflict. And they've actually created a learning curriculum which for international negotiators, particularly those in conflict situations, to do exactly what Deeyah was talking about. So if you're sitting opposite a member of the Taliban, how are you able to situate yourself within their experience? And is that going to lead, that will lead ultimately to better outcomes. And I absolutely agree with this in terms of active citizenship and what I was saying about applied learning. One of those things is that not everybody has to be Greta Thunberg. That's an amazing role model for young people. And it's fantastic that those young leaders are emerging and becoming so prominent in this space, because they do provide a pathway for others to follow suit. But it's also really important in our work to highlight the very small acts of kindness online that make an enormous difference, particularly for those who've been victims of hate speech. So, there are certain tactics, for example, flaming, where, whole groups of people will, in a coordinated way, go and attack somebody in the comment thread of their post. And there's no reason why the same thing couldn't be echoed, but in a positive way. So you mobilize a group of people who just go and flood that person's post with, "We support you, sorry this is such a horrible situation." And if you speak to people who've been victims of abuse online, they will so often say that it was somebody who was a complete stranger taking the time to DM them and just say, "I'm really sorry, I don't know you, but I'm seeing the fact that you are being publicly shamed or humiliated or abused, and I want you to know that it's not okay, and I'm really sorry for you." And it wasn't changing the situation. They're not tech regulators. There's only so much they can achieve. But having that empathetic connection online is absolutely critical, because most people's personal and social lives are now being lived out through digital platforms. So we have to find ways to recreate the immediacy of a face-to-face connection. And then the final thing that I wanted to add on this topic is that when we were creating our Extreme Dialogue set of videos, one of the main things is that you don't delegitimize either end of the experience. So a lot of people had very reasonable grievances that underpinned their disaffection with society. They came from, either they had extremely troubled households, although that, I don't want that to become a stereotype narrative. That isn't true for everybody, but it is true for many people that perpetrators are in some ways also victims, that they've all experienced some form of trauma, even if it's just the trauma of not being very popular at school and not having a lot of friends, and then having a job that they find unsatisfying and feeling economically marginalized. So, you don't be overly critical of what that initial spark is that drives somebody down a radical pathway. And then equally, it's so interesting how many of the stories that planted the very first seed of doubt, which eventually cracked open the whole ideology, was usually something like, "I broke my arm and I went to hospital and my doctor was a Jewish doctor. And he could see I had a swastika tattooed on my arm and he just treated me as normal because he's a doctor and that's his Hippocratic oath." And there was no discussion in the GP's surgery about the nature of white supremacy. It's nothing to do with that. And it didn't happen immediately, but what it did was completely invalidate the narrative that he had been fed as part of the neo-Nazi movement. And as soon as that seed of doubt is planted in there, it's so easy for that to then, create a pathway out of those movements. So those small acts of kindness, and thinking about what those small acts of kindness mean in the online space, should really, really be a part of digital citizenship education.
We have a question about engaging displaced communities, and we have another question about how do you have difficult conversations with, how do you maintain trust when ultimately, if someone says, "I'm going to commit a violent act," you have an obligation to report that to the authorities. However, there is a gray line where if you think someone might do something drastically, harm themselves or harm another. I was a teacher, and I always, this is always a tough question of whether the person was just having a bad day. How do you handle that? Any of our panelists, feel free to jump in.
I work with a great organization called Parents for Peace, which people can find at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. We have a U.S. national helpline at 844-49-PEACE, where any people with those questions can call and get help. And you're right, Mike, there are times where authorities need to be alerted. If there's imminent violence, it's not something that we can afford to ignore. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are in that space where they're like, I don't know if I should call the cops about this guy, or maybe there's some other way. Well, our helpline is designed for just that. So anybody with those types of questions about a friend or a loved one is welcome to reach out. And we have mental health professionals as well as amazing public, private sector people on hand waiting to help out.
I wanted to add that a lot of the people who are, we talked about the extended periods of time online, and I think we have to also acknowledge that many of these people who are violent it's actually greater likelihood that they will be violent to themselves. And so that I think it's really important that as we are thinking sort of outside the box about how to approach this in a holistic fashion, and especially with Mayor Tait's understanding that we put kindness first, that it's less about informing on the person to the police and maybe more about preventing them committing any kind of self-harm in addition to harming others. And so that's where I would reframe it as, we're not acting, when you're looking at CVE or PVE, preventing violent extremism, it's less about informing on a community and being an extended wing of the police or the security services. And it's more that we're really concerned that people do not hurt themselves in addition to hurting others.
I was just going to add too that I think one of the things that we can learn from other countries, in Germany, where basically every community, small town district has something called mobile advisors for that combat far right extremism. That if you're a coworker, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a coach, and you see signs of something, you can reach out and have an evaluation done and have and get resources, sort of the kind of resources that Arno's talking about, to help kind of gauge, does this cross the line? Where are some mental health counselors who might be experienced with this? Because that's another big problem, is that a lot of the psychologists and therapists aren't really informed about how to address this issue. And then parents who even are resourced and are trying to take their adolescents or kids for help can't find somebody who knows what they're doing. So I think that speaks to the need of local communities and mayors and school districts and at the policy level to provide and think about this not just as isolated parents and teachers working on their own, sort of on the front lines, but that they are networked within a larger set of resources where they can go for help. And that speaks sort of to the role of school leaders like principals too, and setting a culture within a school that that lets teachers know there are other people to go to, that they're not totally isolated. And then the other thing I want to say about that too is that I think it's also important to remember, sometimes we talk about this, even I catch myself talking about it, as if all teachers are well-intentioned and all parents are well-intentioned. And we know that, in the COVID-19 era, especially, domestic violence rates are high, child abuse rates are high. We have teachers who, unfortunately, even if well-intentioned, are caught in systems that promote their merit pay based on really narrow metrics about achievement of their students on standardized tests, where there's not a lot of space for them to be able to think about empathy in their classroom or think about what it means to be a digital citizen. And I think that's where these broader policy conversations also have to happen in ways that make changes to some of these larger systems that, I hate to say it, maybe incentivize, but also liberate teachers from some of those constraints so that they can spend some time thinking on those things. And I think that's, so we need both bottom up and top down kind of engagement on these issues, I guess.
I want to turn to Mayor Tait. Through the State Department, through the Strong Cities Network, you've traveled to Denmark, Germany, and India. A year ago, we went to Dusseldorf, Cologne, and Bonn to learn about German, what they're doing to address violent extremism. What were some of the lessons you picked up, and what are some of the challenges or opportunities that are there in terms of observing what best practices, lessons learned other communities have experience in trying to model, pilot them in your community?
That the trip we took to Germany was very interesting, because you had we met with a former neo-Nazi and had a deep discussion with him, and then we met with people that worked with former ISIS fighters coming back to some of these towns, and it was the same thing. It was, to me, it was the same thing. What turned people around were acts of kindness, and the person who was a neo-Nazi, I remember him saying he is a homeless person who he almost actually did killing, who spoke actually spoke at his trial, incredible act of kindness before he had died, for leniency on this this guy, and then also a Iranian prisoner or cellmate of his who was very kind to him. He said that's what turned him around. And then the people dealing with the former ISIS fighters said, I remember him saying, he goes, it's the little things, like if we help them find a job, that seems to turn them around. Just a little act of kindness, again, doing something for someone else, no expectation of return. So I thought it was interesting, the same thing, because I guess we're all humans. That was that came back very powerful. So it is, and it also is kind of interesting. What brought them in was the same thing too. And I mentioned that word. And listening to you all today is this idea of false kindness that brings them in, because the neo-Nazi was being bullied at school and being made fun of and things like that. And here's this group of kind of older kids or adults who took advantage of that with what seemed like kind acts to him, but of course they weren't, because they had that kind of a sinister motive, not kind of a sinister motive behind it. It wasn't doing something for someone else, no expectation of return. It was, they wanted a big return from it. So it wasn't kindness, but it was false kindness, and tricked them into joining. And also the same thing with the ISIS recruiters, same thing. But it's very, very interesting. It made me think also with Arno, when Arno spoke at this conference out here in California, and I brought to that conference Lama Tenzin, the Dalai Lama's emissary, and we had a deep discussion after he spoke. And he says, there's something. It's very interesting with Arno. He talked about why he switched, and he talked about, because at one side of him there's this. He said, he talked about how he liked to beat up people, and it was fun, and he had an enjoyment. But he says he also knew deep down it was wrong. And he said, "What's happening?" And he points to his heart. He goes, "What's happening deep down at that moment when it changes? When he changes, even though he liked it, he knew it was wrong." And he says that has something to do with kindness at that point. And I thought that's, maybe that's that point. And Arno, I'd love to ask you that question. It's like that point when it happens, that pivot point. I think it has something to do with kindness. That's at least what I think. If you could spread that in culture, and we all have, and everyone's got the ability to affect culture. Everybody does. It's very empowering, and it doesn't cost anything. And that's why I'm so. This is the antidote, and I know it's the antidote. And we just need to all work on it. And sometimes, you can't look to politicians to change, because politicians, I can tell you, politicians generally follow. They aren't going to lead. They're going to follow culture. And so it's not something we're going to wait for Washington or anyone else to lead us out of this. It's going to be all of us. And but that's the best way to do it anyway. Anyway, I'm going on too long. Sorry, Michael.
No worries. And one thing I wanted to mention, when I was trying to find the article that you wrote in the Orange County Register about the KKK march in 2016, I actually came across an article where you, Mayor Tait, there was a girl who was drowning outside where you live in Anaheim, and you helped save her. So it's not just kindness; it's acts of bravery. It's and so you actually practice what you preach. I want to end the conversation, give the final word to Deeyah. I mentioned earlier you growing up as the child of in Norway, as the child of immigrants from Pakistan. You faced discrimination. You were interviewed by the BBC a couple of years ago, and that clip went viral, talking about the discrimination that you and others, people who are brown skin, of immigrant backgrounds, have faced. What are your thoughts on changing the culture where if people were nicer to you or to others, or the people who you interviewed in the documentary Jihad, do you think that would have changed their their path? Because obviously, you chose a nonviolent path, but others may not.
Yeah, I do think that it matters how we deal with that type of experience. I think, we can either write it off as, well, that's just the price you pay for a multicultural society. That's just, you're just a casualty of that, and deal with it. And when I was growing up, my dad always told me, you just have to give it time. When it comes to these types of experiences, you have to give it time. The longer we live together, the closer we'll become, the more we'll understand each other, and the more all of these sorts of feelings and behaviors will disappear. And the consequences of it, which, just this violence and this kind of hatred just breeds more of it, that will all just fall to the wayside. And the reality is that that's not happened. That's not happening. And what's very clear to me, having done some of the work that I've done, and also having to sort of confront my own stuff and my own baggage around exactly these questions, is that we don't have a choice but to commit to each other. We don't have a choice but to actively participate in this. No one's going to come and save us. No one's going to come and fix this. This is down to each and every one of us, to whatever tiny or large extent that we're capable of. We have to make our communities what we want them to be. We have to contribute to our society and pour into it the values that we think are important. And I think, we've spoken about kindness, we've spoken about, empathy, belonging, recognizing people's humanity, and other terms like that. I think hope is another word that's very important to me. And I would say in all the work that I've done, I actually entered these films very pessimistic, quite honestly, thinking, people will just be what people are, and kind of the darkness and violent impulses that people have, there's not much we can do about it. It's natural, it's just human. But just as human as, fear is, violence is, hatred is, so is hope. So is compassion, so is kindness, so is love, so is treating each other with dignity. But I think it's like the Mayor Tait was saying as well, it's about which aspects of our humanity does our culture actually amplify and reward as well. We as a culture, we are constantly rewarding violence with a lot of attention, with a lot of, the kids, some of the kids that I spoke to, who joined ISIS, and actually two of them got in touch with me after they saw the Jihad film, and they were in Syria. How they saw the film in Syria, I don't know. But they sent me this long, pissed off message saying, why are you making us look weak? We are brave, we are courageous, we are strong. Why are you making us look like we have feelings? All this kind of stuff. And I was sitting there sort of chuckling, going, you don't want to be seen as a human, because once you're seen as a human, the problem becomes tangible. It becomes something we can do something about. That's where that crack of hope, that little fracture shows up, where you realize, I can do something about this. These problems are huge, but just a tiny, tiny step at a time, and one interaction after the next will solve it, but we have to be willing to do it. So I would say hope and kindness, like the mayor said as well, I think is just as contagious as fear and hate is, and violence is. So the rest of us have to do a better job, and the rest of us have to make a commitment to each other that we want to make this thing work. We want to coexist. We want it to be peaceful. We want a society that's inclusive and that affords dignity and rights to everybody, not just to me or people who look like me. Well, and teachers are a huge part of that. Actually, one of the biggest parts of this, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm a former teacher, and I can tell you that I felt overwhelmed most of the time, which is why I'm no longer teaching. But I commend those who still do it, and perhaps one day I'll rejoin the ranks. But I do want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the Institute for Strategic Dialogue for hosting this discussion. South by Southwest, it was the right decision to cancel the conference, and we're grateful for the opportunity to do this virtually. I want to thank the attendees. We'll try to archive this on YouTube. And I do want to mention, if you do want to see Deeyah's two of your documentaries, White Right and Jihad, they're both available on YouTube, which exposes, they used to be on Netflix and now they're on YouTube. So once again, thank you everybody. Stay safe and be kind to each other.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.